It all starts with something simple, a visit to the police station. Just another citizen filing a report. But beneath the surface, it's a powder keg, waiting to explode. When one arrogant cop thinks he can intimidate, belittle, and break a black woman who dares to stand her ground, he has no idea who he's dealing with. Because she's not just another face in the crowd, she's the new police chief. And she's about to turn his whole world upside down. What unfolds next is a fierce clash of ego, corruption, and raw justice. A fight for power that will leave you questioning everything. And trust me, you won't believe how this ends until we dive in. Before we get started, take a moment, drop a comment below, and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. We love hearing from you, and your voice is part of this journey too. It started like any other day. The fluorescent lights of the Birmingham precinct flickered overhead, casting a cold, sterile glow on worn linoleum floors and desks stacked high with paperwork that no one seemed interested in. The air felt thick with the unspoken tension that often lingers in places where power goes unchecked for too long. And then she walked in, Maya Grant, a black woman in her mid-50s, wearing a simple dark blouse tucked into a pair of faded jeans. Her posture calm, her expression unreadable, her long black hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. She didn't wear a badge, didn't come in with an escort or fanfare, just walked straight through the front doors like any ordinary citizen. But Maya Grant was anything but ordinary. The moment she stepped inside, the room seemed to exhale, like it knew something was about to change but didn't know what. She moved with quiet confidence, scanning the room, feeling the weight of the eyes that glanced at her, and quickly looked away. To the officers in that room, she was just another black woman, another voice to dismiss, another problem to ignore. At the front desk, behind a mountain of reports and a half-drunk cup of coffee, sat Brian Kessler, a man built like a linebacker, with graying hair cut short and eyes that looked through people more than at them. He didn't even glance up from his computer as Maya approached. "What do you need?" he barked, his tone carrying more irritation than curiosity. His fingers tapped lazily at the keyboard, his attention fixed anywhere but on her. "I'm here to report a theft," Maya said, her voice steady, unwavering. Kessler paused, lifted his head, and looked her over, up and down like he was sizing up a problem he didn't want to solve. His lips curled into a smirk. "Another one," he thought. He leaned back in his chair and let out a mocking laugh, loud enough for a few officers nearby to hear. "Let me guess," he sneered. "A phone? Maybe a purse? Trust me, lady, those things never turn up again." Maya held his gaze. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply stood her ground. "I want to file a report," she replied. "That is my right." But her composure only seemed to irritate him more. Kessler pushed back from his desk, grabbed his coffee cup, and stood. The room seemed to shrink as he closed the space between them. Other officers glanced up. A few froze in place, pretending to be busy with whatever paperwork they could grab. No one said a word. No one moved. "You know," Kessler said, lowering his voice to something rough and ugly, "people like you should know their place. We've got real work to do here. Not time for your petty problems." The word petty hung in the air, heavy with contempt. Maya didn't move. She stood tall, unblinking, as if daring him to follow through on whatever threat lingered behind his words. And that's when he did it. With a flick of his wrist, Kessler tilted the cup, and a stream of hot coffee splashed across Maya's face. The hiss of liquid hitting skin echoed in the silent room, followed by the soft drip of coffee falling from her chin to the floor. Maya staggered back a step. One cheek burned from the heat, but her eyes never wavered. They stayed locked on Kessler, burning hotter than the coffee that scalded her skin. For a moment, the whole precinct held its breath. Chris Meyer, a rookie officer standing near the break room door, clenched his fists so tight His knuckles turned white. He took half a step forward, but stopped when Kessler shot him a glare, sharp enough to cut. Everyone else? They turned away, pretended they didn't see, pretended they didn't hear. The fear of becoming Kessler's next target froze them in place. Kessler smirked and stepped back, the cup still dripping in his hand. "Consider that a lesson in respect," he muttered, turning back toward his desk like nothing had happened. "Now get lost." Maya wiped the coffee from her face with the back of her hand. She could feel the burn, the sting, but she wouldn't let him see her break. "Not here, not now." "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice low but laced with steel. "Thank you for showing me exactly how things work around here." And then she turned and walked away, leaving behind the suffocating silence, leaving behind the stares filled with pity and helplessness. Each step she took echoed through the room like a drumbeat, steady, deliberate, unbroken. Kessler sat back down, smug as ever, tapping at his keyboard like the confrontation never happened. But beneath that smirk, something unsettled stirred. Somewhere deep, he felt the weight of a mistake he hadn't yet realized he'd made. Maya didn't stop. She moved down the hallway, coffee dripping from her chin onto the cracked tile below. The fluorescent lights flickered above her, reflecting off the wet trail left in her wake. Her cheek throbbed, but she didn't raise a hand to touch it. She didn't slow down. She just walked, because Maya Grant wasn't just any woman. She was the new police chief. And Brian Kessler had just made the worst mistake of his career. But that's just the beginning. Because what comes next isn't just about one officer's arrogance. It's about a whole system built to protect men like Kessler. And Maya Grant? She wasn't here to fit into that system. She was here to change it, one step at a time. And trust me, you're going to want to see how this story ends. But before we go any further, drop a comment below. Let us know where you're listening from and how stories like this resonate with you. Because this fight, it's bigger than any one person, and your voice matters here. Ready? Let's dive deeper. Maya didn't stop until she reached the far end of the precinct, the quiet hallway where the walls hadn't been repainted in years, where the lights flickered and hummed overhead. Her heart pounded, but her face stayed calm. The sting on her cheek was sharp, but she wore that pain like armor. At the end of the hall, a door creaked open. Standing there, waiting in the shadows, was the only person in this building who knew who she really was. Deputy Chief Samuel Owens. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 60s. Owens carried himself with a steady calm. His dark brown skin, peppered gray beard, and watchful eyes had seen more than most in his time behind the badge. He'd been Maya's ally long before today, a trusted confidant, someone who understood what this mission really meant. "You all right?" Owens asked, his voice low but filled with concern. Maya stopped just shy of him, the heat from her cheek still radiating. She didn't answer right away. She pulled the hair tie from the back of her head, letting her long black hair fall over her shoulders, partly covering the reddened skin. The gesture wasn't for vanity. It was for control, a way to shield herself from showing too much. "I'm fine," she said finally, her tone colder than usual. Owens tilted his head, reading the stiffness in her voice. He knew Maya well enough to know that beneath that calm exterior, something was burning hotter than the coffee Kessler had thrown at her. "I assume you heard everything," Maya added. Owens nodded. His gaze was heavy with understanding, the weight of a man who had wanted to step in but had honored her request to stand back. "I did." They both stood in that hallway for a moment, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound between them. "I wanted to step in," Owens admitted, "but you were clear you needed to see it for yourself." Maya's eyes darkened, her jaw set. "I did need to see it, and now I have." The thing is, Maya Grant wasn't the kind of leader who came in blind, assuming she knew the fight ahead. No, she wanted to feel it. She wanted to see firsthand the rot, that hid beneath the surface, the unchecked power, the fear that froze every officer in place. When Kessler lashed out, this wasn't just about policy. It wasn't about paperwork or rules on a page. It was about the culture, the silence, the complicity. And now, she'd seen it. Every look that turned away, every officer who stayed silent, while one of their own crossed the line that was what she was up against. As Owens stepped aside to let her pass, Maya didn't say another word. She walked into her new office, the door clicking shut behind her. The room was quiet, sterile, the way offices in old precincts tend to be, faded certificates on the walls, a heavy wooden desk, the faint smell of old coffee lingering in the air. She sat down in the worn leather chair, resting her elbows on the desk, letting her hands clasp together, fingers tight. For the first time since stepping into that building, she allowed herself to breathe. But her mind was racing, because this wasn't just about Kessler. No, this fight went deeper. Maya leaned back in her chair, eyes drifting toward the window, watching the slow drift of clouds outside, and that's when her thoughts pulled her back. Back to where it all began, to her grandmother, Evelyn. Evelyn Grant had been a firebrand in her day, a civil rights activist who never backed down, never stayed silent. Maya could still hear her voice, still see the way Evelyn stood tall in the face of injustice. Even when the cost was high, there was one memory, one moment that Maya carried with her like a scar on her soul. She must have been 10, maybe 11, standing outside a courthouse downtown. Evelyn was there, leading a small protest, demanding answers for a local black man beaten and left for dead by officers who were never charged. Maya remembered the shouting, the way her grandmother raised her fist high in the air, calling for justice. And then she remembered the shove, the violent push from a police officer twice Evelyn's size, knocking her to the ground. Maya had rushed to her side, helped her up, watched as Evelyn wiped the blood from her lip and stood taller than ever. "They'll never give it to us," Evelyn had whispered that day, her voice shaking with pain but steady with purpose. "We have to take it." Piece by piece, that moment shaped Maya's life. It built the foundation of who she was. And it's what led her here. She hadn't planned to join the police force. Not at first. The very idea seemed like betrayal. But Evelyn, wise as ever, had challenged her thinking. "You can't change a system from the outside," Evelyn had told her once, sipping tea in their tiny kitchen. "You've got to step inside. You've got to stand where they stand, and then you fight." So Maya did. She went to college, studied criminal law, joined the academy, took every beating the system threw at her and kept standing. They told her she wasn't tough enough, that she didn't belong, that she wouldn't make it. And yet here she was, chief of police. But that title? It wasn't a shield. It wasn't armor. It was just a starting point. The fight she was walking into now, that was the real battle. Maya stood from her desk, walked to the small mirror on the wall, and stared at her reflection. The redness on her cheek was beginning to fade, but the fire behind her eyes burned brighter than ever. She wouldn't let this moment pass, wouldn't let Kessler's arrogance go unchecked. No, she would hold on to this anger, this pain, and she would use it, fuel for the long road ahead. Because the truth was clear, this precinct, this system, it wasn't going to change itself. And Maya Grant? She wasn't here to ask permission. She was here to tear down the walls, brick by brick, and rebuild something worth standing for. The coffee had cooled, but the fire inside her? That was just getting started. While Maya stood in front of that mirror, gathering the fire in her chest, Brian Kessler sat comfortably at his desk, leaning back in his old, worn-out swivel chair like nothing had happened. Like throwing hot coffee at a black woman was just another box to check off on his day. And for him, it was, to Brian Kessler, this was just another Tuesday. The precinct buzzed faintly around him, phones ringing. keyboards clicking, but none of that touched him. He sat there, arms crossed, smirking to himself, believing he had once again reminded everyone of their place. This wasn't new for him. It was survival. See, Brian Kessler didn't always wear this smugness like a badge of honor. No. There was a lifetime ago, when he believed in the badge, believed in the mission. When he first pinned that silver star to his uniform fresh out of the academy, he stood in front of a mirror, full of hope, convinced he could make a difference. But life has a way of changing people. Kessler's story wasn't one of heroism. It was one of bitterness, the slow erosion of a soul. His father, Harold Kessler, had been an officer in the same precinct back in the 60s and 70s, a time when the rules were different, when the lines between law and oppression blurred in the haze of segregation and resistance. Harold was one of those men who wore his uniform like a second skin. And when the world started changing, when marches and protests called for justice, for equality, Harold stood his ground. But the world kept moving without him. Harold Kessler died bitter and forgotten, pushed out of the force after the department was forced to clean up its image in the late 80s. No pension, no recognition, just a broken man sitting on his porch, grumbling about how the world went soft. Brian was 15 when he watched his father crumble, when he saw the man who raised him, the man who taught him that order was everything, stripped of the only thing he cared about. So, when Brian put on the badge himself, it wasn't about justice, it wasn't about protecting anyone, it was about control, about never ending up like his old man, powerless and cast aside. For the first few years, he played the part, responded to calls, filed his reports, but every time he walked the streets of Birmingham, every time he looked into the eyes of the people he was supposed to serve, that bitterness festered. It told him that respect was taken, not given, that power was the only currency that mattered, and he learned fast how to spend it. It didn't take long before Brian found ways to make sure no one questioned him. He built a network, a tight circle of officers who understood the rules, not the ones written in the handbook, but the real ones, the rules of survival. He knew their secrets, their fears. The rookie who froze up during his first armed robbery call, the sergeant who drank a little too much and forgot to lock up evidence, the detective who turned a blind eye when things got messy. Kessler kept score. And when people like Chris Meyer came through the door, young, fresh-faced rookies, with their heads full of ideals, he made sure they understood how things really worked. A glare here, a subtle threat there, a reminder that speaking out wasn't just about risking your job, it was about risking everything. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to swing his fists. Fear did the work for him. 15 years at this precinct, and Brian Kessler had learned how to wear that fear like armor. He leaned into it, let it shape him, because deep down, he believed the world was a dangerous place, and the only way to survive was to be dangerous right back. So when Maya Grant walked through that door, holding her head high, speaking with that steady, unflinching voice, Kessler felt it, that old itch, the challenge. But he wasn't worried. Not really, because as far as he was concerned, women like Maya didn't last in places like this. He'd seen them come and go, the ones who thought they could change the system, who thought justice was something you could build from the inside. He broke them all. Maya? She was no different. Not to him. Throwing that coffee in her face wasn't just an outburst. It was a test, a message, a reminder that this was his house, his world, and that no matter what title she wore, it wouldn't protect her. The other officers? They wouldn't say a word. They never did. Some felt sorry. Some felt disgusted. But fear kept them in line. And Kessler, he smiled. Because in his mind, he'd already won. But what Brian Kessler didn't know, what he couldn't even begin to imagine, was that this time was different. Because Maya Grant wasn't like the others. while Kessler sat back, his chair creaking beneath him, letting that smugness settle in. Maya was already moving, already thinking 2 steps ahead. He didn't know it yet, but the game had shifted. And Brian Kessler? He was playing checkers, while Maya was playing chess. This wasn't just another woman with a complaint. This was the woman who'd come to tear down the walls he'd built. But in that moment, he didn't feel it, didn't see it. Kessler leaned back, sipped what little coffee was left in his cup, and looked around the precinct like he owned it, like nothing had changed. But change was coming, and it was closer than he thought. The precinct was unusually quiet that morning. Phones still rang, the hum of computers still filled the air, but there was something underneath it all, something tense. The kind of quiet that settles in just before a storm. And for Brian Kessler, it was just another day. He strolled into the morning briefing like he owned the place, wearing that same smug grin, that same air of untouchable confidence. His buddies nodded at him. A few others avoided his gaze entirely. He'd sent a message the day before, loud and clear. That woman, the one who came in with her head too high, wasn't going to be a problem. Not here. Not in his house. Kessler leaned back in his chair near the back of the room, arms folded across his chest, settling in for whatever mundane updates were on the agenda. Probably more paperwork, maybe a lecture about community relations or officer wellness. He didn't care. This was routine. This was his territory. But the moment the door opened, that routine shattered. The room fell silent. Because standing in the doorway wasn't some faceless bureaucrat. It wasn't a senior officer coming in to bark orders. It was her, Maya Grant. But not the Maya Kessler thought he'd broken. No, this wasn't the woman from the day before, dressed down in plain clothes, coffee dripping down her face. This Maya stood tall, in a crisp, pristine police uniform. Her badge gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Her dark hair, loose just yesterday, was now neatly tied back, the faint redness on her cheek barely visible beneath her composed expression. She carried herself like steel. The officers shifted uncomfortably. Some straightened in their chairs. Others glanced around, unsure what was happening. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just another meeting. Maya walked to the front of the room without hesitation, placed a leather case on the table, and turned to face the room. Her gaze scanned each face, pausing just long enough for everyone to feel the weight of her presence. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear, firm. "I understand some of you have had an eventful start to your day yesterday." The tension thickened. No one dared respond. Maya let the silence sit for a moment, let it press down on them. Then she opened the leather case, revealing a set of documents. She didn't even glance down at them. "My name is Maya Grant," she continued, her tone unwavering. "As of today, I am your new chief of police." A wave of shock rippled through the room. You could feel it, the disbelief, the sudden shift as reality settled in. A few officers exchanged nervous glances. Others froze, unsure how to react. But at the back of the room, Brian Kessler sat stone still. His smirk vanished, his arms unfolded. For a second, he looked like a man who couldn't quite process what he was seeing. "No way," he muttered, loud enough for the words to carry across the room. Maya turned her eyes on him, sharp, cold, unflinching. "Oh yes, Brian Kessler. Very much so." The rest of the room sat frozen, caught between fear and fascination. No one dared move. No one dared breathe too loud. Maya turned back to the group, sweeping the room with her gaze again. "I've spent the past 2 weeks observing this precinct," she said, "watching how things work, watching how you operate when you think no one is paying attention." Her voice never wavered. Her posture never faltered. "And let me be blunt," she continued. "There's a lot that needs to change." Kessler sat back, forcing his arms to cross again, but his jaw clenched tighter. His eyes narrowed, studying her, measuring her. trying to figure out how to play this. But inside? Inside, he felt it, the ground shifting beneath him. Maya didn't give him or anyone else time to recover. "This isn't going to be business as usual," she said. "There will be reforms, mandatory ethics training, restructured complaint processes, an independent oversight unit. We are going to serve this community the way we are supposed to." The weight of her words pressed against every wall of that room. Some officers lowered their heads, guilt flashing across their faces. Others, like Chris Meyer, stole glances at Kessler, watching, waiting. But Kessler? He stayed silent. For now, Maya let the silence stretch again, giving the weight of her promises time to settle in every corner of the room. She wanted them to feel it, wanted them to understand this wasn't some empty speech. This was the beginning of a fight. Finally, she closed the leather case, stepped back from the table, and let her gaze settle once more on Kessler. "I look forward to working with all of you," she said, though her eyes were locked on him. "Especially you, Officer Kessler." And with that, the meeting ended. One by one, the officers stood, filing out in near silence. Whispers filled the hallway as soon as they crossed the threshold. Questions, speculations, disbelief. Some talked about Maya, wondering who she really was. Some glanced at Kessler, wondering what would happen next. Kessler stayed seated, hands gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles pale beneath the pressure. Chris Meyer paused at the door, his gaze flickering between Maya and Kessler. He felt it too, that shift in the air, the sense that the unspoken rules of this place had been rewritten in a single morning. But he also knew something else. This wasn't over, not even close, because Brian Kessler wasn't the kind of man to back down, not without a fight. Brian Kessler sat alone in that briefing room long after everyone else had cleared out. His fists were clenched, white-knuckled, gripping the arms of his chair as if holding onto the last shred of control he thought he had. "Chief of Police." Her words echoed in his mind like a bad joke. Maya Grant, the same woman he'd thrown coffee on just the day before, the same woman he had dismissed without a second thought. She wasn't just some troublemaker looking for attention. She was the one person who could tear apart everything he'd spent years building. But Kessler? He didn't panic. Not outwardly. No, that wasn't his style. He stood slowly, smoothing out his uniform, forcing his face back into that familiar smugness as he walked toward the door. If anyone passed him in the hallway, they wouldn't see the cracks forming beneath his skin. They'd see the same Kessler they always had, calm, confident, untouchable. But deep down, the rage burned. He couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe someone like her had slipped through the cracks and risen this high without him knowing. This was supposed to be his territory, his house. He'd worked too hard, pulled too many strings to let anyone, especially her, challenge that. But he had a plan. Kessler always had a plan. And Maya Grant? She was about to learn that power didn't come from a title. It came from who you knew, what you controlled. And Kessler, he controlled more than anyone realized. The precinct wasn't just a workplace. It was his domain. Over the years, he'd built an army of silent allies, officers who owed him favors, supervisors who'd turned a blind eye, rookies too scared to challenge him. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew the secrets. And when someone threatened that, he fought back. He started small, the way he always did, whispering to a few trusted voices, letting the doubt spread like smoke through a closed room. "She doesn't know how things work here," he muttered to a couple of his closest allies in the locker room that afternoon. "She's an outsider. Came in swinging like she's gonna fix everything." You know how that ends. The words didn't need to be loud. They just needed to be planted. And like seeds, they grew. By the end of the day, officers were whispering in corners. Some nodded along, others kept their distance, but Kessler saw the shift. the unease. He knew how to play the long game. And this was just the opening move. Maya Grant sat in her office that night, the weight of the day pressing on her like a storm cloud. She could feel it, the tension in the walls, the quiet glances exchanged in the hallways. She knew what Kessler was doing. He wasn't the type to confront her directly. Not yet, no. Men like him chipped away at you piece by piece. But she didn't come here expecting this to be easy. Owens knocked softly on her door, stepping inside with a worried look. "He's moving fast," Owens said. No need to explain who he meant. Maya nodded, already sensing the undercurrents. "Let him," she replied, calm but firm. "Let him think he's winning." Owens studied her, the concern etched deep on his face. "You sure you're ready for this?" Maya leaned back, folding her arms across her chest. "I've been ready my whole life." But readiness didn't make the days ahead any easier. As Kessler's whispers spread, so did the resistance. Officers who'd once offered polite nods now avoided her gaze. Meetings grew colder. Conversations stopped when she entered a room. The change wasn't loud. It wasn't explosive. It was quiet, calculated. And Kessler? He thrived in that space. By the end of the week, he'd gathered his core group officers who owed him, officers who feared him, officers who believed the old way was the only way. They met behind closed doors, voices low, heads bent together. "She's here to tear this place apart," Kessler told them, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you're safe? You think she won't come for you next?" And the fear worked. It always did. But there were cracks forming that Kessler couldn't see. Small ones, quiet ones. Chris Meyer, the rookie who'd watched in silence as Kessler threw that coffee, felt the shift too. But unlike the others, he didn't lean into fear. He felt something else. Guilt. Every night, as he sat in his small apartment, he replayed that moment over and over. The way Maya stood tall, the way Kessler smirked, the way Chris did nothing, and that guilt gnawed at him, because deep down, he knew this wasn't right. But fear? Fear kept him silent. For now, back at the precinct, Kessler pushed harder. He dug up every scrap of dirt he could find on Maya old cases, past decisions, anything he could twist into a weapon. And when the dirt ran thin, he spun his own stories. "She's not here for us," he told anyone who would listen. "She's here to make a name for herself, to ruin this department." And slowly, the whispers became louder. Maya felt it every time she stepped into a room. The weight of the doubt, the eyes that watched her, waiting for her to fail. But she didn't flinch, because Maya Grant had faced worse than whispers, and she wasn't going anywhere. It didn't take long before Brian Kessler's quiet campaign turned into something louder, something dangerous. The whispers became stories. The stories became headlines. It started with a small article buried deep in a local blog one that didn't pull much weight, but had just enough reach to get the right people talking. "New police chief's controversial past raises questions." The headline read. It didn't outright accuse Maya Grant of anything illegal, but it didn't have to. The article painted her as an outsider, as someone with an agenda. It mentioned an old case from another city where evidence went missing under her watch. It hinted that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the leader this community needed. That was all Kessler needed to get the ball rolling. Within days, more articles popped up. Radio hosts started asking questions. Who is Maya Grant? They demanded. What's she really here for? The doubt Kessler had planted inside the precinct now echoed outside its walls. Community members, already wary of anyone in uniform, began to look at Maya with suspicion. Protests sprang up almost overnight. Small at first. A few people outside the station holding signs that read, "We deserve better and don't trust outsiders." But they grew, and as they grew, so did the noise. Maya watched it unfold from her office window, her jaw tight, her fingers drumming a steady rhythm on the desk. She wasn't surprised. She'd seen this before. This was how men like Kessler fought. They didn't argue with facts. They didn't fight fair. They stirred the pot until the people turned against you. But she wasn't backing down. Owens stepped into her office late that afternoon, holding a printout of the latest article. "They're twisting everything they can." Maya picked up the sheet, scanning the words that accused her of chasing headlines instead of real reform. She let out a slow breath, steadying herself. "Let them talk," she said quietly. "The louder they get, the more desperate they sound." Owens frowned. The tide of public opinion was shifting fast. "She's coming for us," he told them. "She's here to make an example out of every last one of us." Officers, who had once stayed neutral, now leaned toward Kessler's corner, some because they agreed with him, most because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't. And Kessler? He thrived on that fear, but there was one thing Kessler hadn't counted on: Chris Meyer. The rookie officer still sat quietly in the background, still kept his head down, but every headline, every whispered accusation, every protest sign outside the station, it all chipped away at the wall of silence he'd built around himself. Chris had seen the truth with his own eyes. He'd watched Kessler throw that coffee, watched Maya stand tall, not just in that moment, but every day since. And the more Kessler pushed, the more Chris felt the weight of his own inaction pressing down on him. Maya, for her part, stayed the course. She held meetings with community leaders, listened to their concerns, explained her vision for reform, but no matter what she said, the shadow of doubt Kessler had cast stretched long and wide. And then the media hit harder. One morning, Owens burst into Maya's office, a worried look on his face. "You need to see this," he said, flipping his phone around to show her the screen. Another article, this one bigger, louder. The headline blared, "New Police Chief Under Fire Ties to Past Corruption." The article dredged up her past mentor, a respected officer who'd later been caught accepting bribes. It twisted Maya's association with him, suggesting she'd looked the other way. It was a stretch, but in the court of public opinion, facts didn't matter. Maya's stomach tightened. She set the phone down and stared out the window at the growing crowd of protesters. Outside the station, their chants rose through the glass, muffled but fierce. "She's hiding something," they shouted. "We can't trust her." Owens paced behind her, frustration in every step. "We can fight this. Issue a statement. Set the record straight." But Maya shook her head. "Not yet," she said. "If we respond now, we play into their hands. They want us to panic." And that was the truth. Kessler wasn't just attacking her reputation. He was playing the long game, eroding the trust she was trying to build, turning the community against her before she could even get started. That night, as the station emptied out, Maya stayed behind, sitting at her desk long after the lights had dimmed. She pulled out an old photograph from her drawer, a picture of her and her grandmother Evelyn, standing side by side outside a courthouse, fists raised in defiance. She remembered what Evelyn always said: "Justice isn't something you wait for. It's something you fight for." The next morning, as the protests grew louder, Maya walked out of the station, standing on the front steps, facing the crowd head on. She didn't carry a microphone, didn't have a press release. She just stood there, letting them see her, letting them feel her presence. Because sometimes, the loudest response is silence. And sometimes, that silence speaks volumes. But even as she stood there, facing down the rising storm, she knew this was far from over. Brian Kessler wasn't finished. Not even close. The pressure inside the precinct was building. Thick as smoke, the air felt heavier each day, weighed down by the protests outside, the headlines swirling like a storm, and the quiet war being waged inside the station walls. Brian Kessler could feel it. But to him, it was a familiar feeling, because this was how he won. Not in a flash of anger, not in open confrontation, but in the slow, steady grind, twisting the narrative, breaking people down until they questioned everything around them. And now, the station was starting to fracture. Officers who once kept their heads down were choosing sides. Some leaned toward Kessler, believing his warnings that Maya Grant was there to tear the place apart. Others stayed quiet, waiting to see who would come out on top. But for Kessler, waiting wasn't enough. He needed to go further. Late one night, long after most of the officers had cleared out, Kessler met with a handful of his closest allies in a back office. No lights, just the glow from a desk lamp, casting long shadows on the walls. "We can't let her get ahead of this," Kessler said, his voice low, steady. "She's digging." "You know she is." The others exchanged uneasy glances. But Kessler leaned in, pressing harder. "If she finds anything, any skeletons, we're all on the chopping block." There it was. The fear. It hung between them like a noose. "So what do we do?" one officer asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kessler smiled. The kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes. "We make sure she doesn't find anything." And just like that, the plan was set in motion. Files went missing. Complaints that had been buried deep inside the system were quietly shredded or rewritten. Digital records were wiped clean. The web of corruption Kessler had built over the years began to vanish, piece by piece. But not all of it, because in the middle of that quiet cleanup, someone else was watching. Chris Meyer, the rookie officer who'd stayed silent for too long, the one who'd stood frozen as Kessler threw that coffee, the one who knew the weight of regret better than anyone else in that building. Chris hadn't picked a side. Not yet, but as he watched the late-night meetings, heard the whispers behind closed doors, saw the sudden flurry of missing paperwork, he knew. He knew what Kessler was doing. And, more than that, he knew it was wrong. One night, as Chris stayed late under the pretense of catching up on reports, he saw something he couldn't ignore. Kessler, alone in the archive room, pulling files. One after another. Files that should have been locked down. Files on citizen complaints, misconduct reports, internal affairs investigations. Chris sat there, frozen at his desk, watching through the small window into the archive room. His heart pounded, his palms slick with sweat. He knew he should get up, say something, stop it. But the fear held him in place. Kessler finished and walked out like nothing had happened. Chris sat in silence for what felt like hours. But that night, as he lay awake in his apartment, staring at the ceiling, the guilt gnawed at him harder than ever, because this time, he wasn't just watching Kessler hurt someone else. He was watching him bury the truth. The next day, Chris came in early, heart racing, hands shaking. He headed straight for the archives, pulled open the drawers, and sure enough, records were missing, gone. But not all of them. In the rush to clean house, Kessler had missed something. A small folder tucked behind other files. Financial reports, internal memos, email chains, pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, told a story. A story of bribes, of cover-ups, of officers who looked the other way. Chris grabbed the folder, stuffed it under his jacket, and slipped out of the room, heart pounding. And then he did something he never thought he'd do. He knocked on Maya Grant's office door. Maya looked up, surprised to see him, but motioned for him to come in. I found something," Chris stammered, his voice shaking as he pulled out the folder and placed it on her desk. Maya opened it, flipping through the pages. Her expression tightened as she read. She looked up at Chris, eyes sharp. "Where did you get this?" Chris swallowed hard, the weight of his decision pressing down on him. "The archives," he said. "Kessler's been cleaning things out." Maya sat back, processing the information. The evidence wasn't complete, but it was enough. Enough to start connecting dots. Enough to see the bigger picture. "You realize what this means?" she asked him. Chris nodded, fear in his eyes. "I know. It puts you at risk." Chris looked down at his hands, fists clenched tight. "I've been at risk since the day I stepped in here. I just didn't want to see it." Maya studied him for a long moment, seeing the guilt, the fear, but also the courage it took for him to cross that line. "Thank you," she said softly. "This changes everything." But they both knew the truth. This wasn't the end. This was the beginning. Because now they had proof. And Kessler? He was going to fight even harder to keep it buried. The folder Chris Meyer handed over didn't just hold papers, it held the truth. Enough truth to expose years of corruption if it were used the right way. Maya Grant sat at her desk long after Chris left her office that night, turning page after page, feeling the weight of every number, every signature, every lie. But this wasn't just about Brian Kessler anymore. No, this reached deeper. These documents hinted at something larger, a network that went beyond one officer's misconduct. Bribes exchanged hands, cases that mysteriously disappeared, funds redirected under the table, and those emails? They weren't just between Kessler and his closest allies. They pointed to someone higher, a name that kept surfacing again and again: Mark Calloway, a city official with enough influence to keep people like Kessler protected for years. Maya recognized the pattern. She'd seen it before. Corruption didn't work in isolation. It worked in systems, in webs, protected by powerful men who pulled strings from behind the curtain. And now she had proof. But having proof was one thing. Using it? That was something else entirely. The very next morning, the precinct felt different. The usual tension hadn't gone away, but something beneath it had shifted. Officers looked over their shoulders a little more often. Conversations grew quieter, because even though no one knew exactly what Chris had done, they could sense something had changed. Brian Kessler felt it too. He saw the way Chris moved through the station, how his eyes wouldn't meet his. Kessler knew the signs, knew when someone had crossed that invisible line, and that meant it was time to act. Late that evening, Chris left the station and walked toward his car, parked at the far end of the lot. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the pavement. His steps were fast, his heart pounding. He didn't know why he felt nervous, maybe because part of him already knew. And then he saw it. A dark sedan parked at the edge of the lot, headlights off, engine idling. Chris slowed, pretending not to notice, but his pulse quickened. As he reached his car door, a voice called out from the shadows. "Meyer?" Chris froze, turned, but there was no one. The engine revved. Tires squealed as the car peeled away, leaving nothing but exhaust and the echo of its warning. Chris stood there, shaken, because this wasn't just a scare tactic. It was a message, and he knew exactly who sent it. When he walked into Maya's office the next day, his face pale, his voice low, he told her everything. "They're watching me," he said, his hands trembling. I don't know what to do." Maya leaned forward, her eyes sharp, steady. "You did the right thing," she told him. "But this is exactly what they want to make you feel alone. You're not." But even as she said the words, she knew the danger had grown. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. This was about protecting the people who dared to stand up. Maya called in Deputy Chief Owens, and the few trusted officers she still had. She laid the documents on the table, pointing to the connections, the names, the trail that led all the way to Calloway's office. "This isn't about one man," she told them. "It's about the whole system." Owens leaned back, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "You really think we can take them all down?" Maya didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice, but they couldn't go public yet. Not without more evidence. Not without locking down every last piece of the puzzle. If they moved too soon, the network would close ranks, bury the truth deeper, and Chris would become their first target. So they planned, quietly, carefully. Meanwhile, Kessler wasn't sitting idle. He kept pushing. The media attacks on Maya grew sharper, more personal. Her past cases were twisted into stories of failure. Her motives were questioned. Her leadership mocked. Protesters outside the precinct waved bigger signs, shouted louder chants. "She's hiding something. Resign." Every morning, Maya stood at her office window, watching the crowd grow. She could feel the weight of their distrust pressing in from all sides. And the worst part? It wasn't just the crowd outside. The walls inside the station were closing in too. Officers who once nodded respectfully now avoided her entirely. Meetings grew colder, shorter. Even Owens, steady as ever, wore the strain on his face. And Kessler? He thrived on it. He stood taller, laughed louder. He leaned against his desk during shifts, spinning stories about how Maya was here to tear the department apart. He sowed doubt like a farmer plants seeds, knowing the harvest would come soon enough. But what he didn't know, Maya was already preparing her move. One evening, when the station had gone quiet, she gathered her team. Owens, Chris, a few other officers who believed in the fight. "We've got enough to make the case," she said, spreading out the files on her desk. "But we need to hit hard. We need to make sure they can't bury it." They worked through the night cross-checking records, verifying signatures, building a case so airtight that even Calloway wouldn't be able to squirm free. And when the morning sun rose, painting the city in shades of gold and gray, Maya knew the battle wasn't over, but the tide? It was about to turn, because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every officer too scared to speak, for every citizen who believed the system would never change, for every voice that had been silenced by men like Kessler. The next move would be hers, and it would be loud. The air was thick outside the precinct that morning. Protesters lined the sidewalks, their chants bouncing off the stone walls like war drums. Signs waved high, demanding justice, calling for Maya Grant's resignation. Cameras flashed as reporters leaned in, eager to capture every flicker of tension. And behind the tall glass windows of her office, Maya Grant stood watching it all unfold. Her reflection stared back at her, calm but resolute. The headlines, the whispers, the isolation, they were all meant to break her, but they didn't know her. They didn't know the fight that burned beneath her calm exterior. Today wasn't about surviving the noise. Today was about turning the tables. She turned from the window, faced her team, and laid out the plan. Owens stood beside her, steady and unyielding. Chris Meyer sat at the table, the weight of his decision still heavy in his eyes, but replaced now with something stronger purpose. "This is it," Maya said, her voice calm but edged with steel. "We go public." They'd spent weeks gathering every piece of evidence, every document, every signature, every crooked email chain that linked Kessler to something bigger, something darker. And now? Now, it was time to pull back the curtain. The press conference was scheduled for noon. But even before the clock struck the hour, the room was packed. Reporters filled every seat, cameras trained on the podium like it was the front line of a battlefield. Maya stood behind the podium, a thick folder in her hands, the very folder Chris had first brought to her. Now overflowing with proof, she looked out over the sea of cameras, of skeptical faces waiting for her to falter. But she didn't falter. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice echoing through the room. "Thank you for being here. Today, I'm going to tell you the truth." The room fell silent. She started slow, laying out the facts. Financial discrepancies, bribes accepted, cases mishandled. It all pointed back to Brian Kessler. But she didn't stop there. "This isn't just about one man," she said, holding up the folder. "This is about a network that has operated in the shadows of this department for years. A system that has protected officers who abuse their power while silencing those who try to stand against them." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle in the room. Kessler didn't act alone. He was shielded, emboldened by people who believed they were untouchable. People like Mark Calloway. The name landed like a thunderclap. Reporters leaned forward, pens racing across notepads. Maya laid out the connections. Emails between Kessler and Calloway. Financial records that traced back to city funds, rerouted for personal gain. Proof that Calloway wasn't just protecting Kessler, he was orchestrating the whole game. But Maya wasn't done. She reached into the folder and pulled out a final piece of evidence, a memo, signed by Calloway, authorizing funds for what was labeled community outreach, but it actually funded smear campaigns against anyone who challenged the system. "The smear campaign against me," she said, holding up the memo, "funded by this network." The room erupted in questions, cameras flashing wildly, but Maya raised her hand, silencing them. "There will be time for questions," she said firmly. "But first, you need to understand this stops now." And just when the tension couldn't climb any higher, the back doors of the room opened. Brian Kessler walked in. He wore that familiar smug grin, his arms folded across his chest like a man untouchable. Protesters outside had painted him as the victim, as the officer standing up against tyranny. And in this moment, he played the part perfectly. He strolled down the aisle, his eyes locked on Maya, daring her to finish what she started. But Maya? She didn't flinch. Instead, she turned toward the officers standing near the side wall, members of the Internal Investigative Unit, badges gleaming. "Officer Kessler," one of them called out, stepping forward, voice clear and loud. "You're under arrest for bribery, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice." The grin on Kessler's face faltered for just a second. His eyes flickered, scanning the room, looking for a lifeline that wasn't there. He stood frozen, caught between defiance and disbelief. "You can't do this," he hissed, his voice low, but loud enough to catch the nearest microphone. "This isn't over." Maya stepped forward, her gaze locked on his. "No, Brian," she said calmly. "This is just the beginning." As the cuffs clicked shut around Kessler's wrists, the room held its breath. Cameras captured every second, every flash of anger on Kessler's face, every ounce of determination in Maya's eyes. They led him out of the room, and the silence broke. Reporters shouted questions. Protesters outside roared louder. But Maya stayed steady. She turned back to the microphone. "What you witnessed today," she said, "is the first step in tearing down the system that has protected people like Brian Kessler, the system that has silenced too many for too long." And though the room buzzed with noise, one thing was clear: the tide had turned. But the fight wasn't over, because Calloway, he was still out there, and Maya knew that bringing down a man like him wouldn't be easy. He had more power, more connections, more ways to twist the truth. But she also knew something else. The momentum had shifted. The cracks in the foundation were showing, and once those cracks start, they spread. Back at the precinct, the news of Kessler's arrest spread like wildfire. Officers whispered in hallways, some in disbelief, others in relief. Chris Meyer walked through those halls, feeling for the first time that maybe, just maybe, things could change. But for Maya, she knew the battle ahead would be even harder. Calloway wouldn't go down without a fight. And the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it would become. But that's the thing about justice. It doesn't come easy. And Maya Grant? She was just getting started. The sound of the handcuffs snapping shut on Brian Kessler's wrists echoed through the precinct like a warning shot. For years, Kessler had operated like a man above the law, protected by shadows, emboldened by the silence of those around him. But as he was led out of the press conference, flanked by internal investigators, something cracked beneath that smug exterior. And outside those walls, the city felt it too. News of Kessler's arrest spread faster than wildfire. Headlines flashed across television screens, radios buzzed with the story, and social media lit up like a beacon. For some, it was a moment of validation, a sign that maybe, just maybe, the system could be held accountable. For others, it sparked outrage. Protesters gathered outside the precinct again. Only this time, their chants were divided. Some demanded Kessler's release, still clinging to the belief that he was a scapegoat. Others called for more heads to roll, demanding the entire system be torn down. The divide was sharp, but one thing was certain: the city was paying attention now. Maya Grant stood in her office, watching the crowd swell outside, feeling the pulse of the city shift beneath her feet. The arrest wasn't the end. It was the first real blow in a much bigger fight. And Maya? She was ready. The very next morning, she convened her team. Owen stood at her side, tired but resolute. Chris Meyer was there too, his back straighter, his eyes clearer. They weren't just witnesses anymore, they were part of the change. "We've got momentum," Maya told them. "But Calloway's still out there. And he's going to hit back." And he did. Before the sun even set that day, another article hit the news. Bigger this time. Bolder. "New leader faces. Troubled past. Who is Maya Grant?" Really? The headline blared. It dredged up every possible piece of dirt they could twist. Her early career struggles, her past mentor's corruption scandal, even personal details: her divorce, her time spent caring for her ailing grandmother were framed as weaknesses. But that wasn't the worst part. The article included anonymous quotes from within the precinct, officers questioning her leadership, officers suggesting she was unstable, unfit to lead. Some of those quotes? Maya recognized the voices behind them. Betrayal cuts deep. Owen slammed the paper down on her desk, his jaw tight. "We know who's feeding them this," he growled. "We can shut it down." But Maya shook her head. "We don't fight this in the shadows," she said. "We fight it out in the open." And that's exactly what she did. The very next day, Maya called for another press conference. The reporters came in droves, hungry for more controversy, more cracks to expose. But Maya didn't flinch. She stood before them, holding up the article for all to see. "They say I'm not fit to lead," she began, her voice steady. "They say my past makes me weak." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Well, they're right about one thing. I'm not perfect. I've made mistakes. I've faced failure. But I've never run from it." Her eyes swept across the room, locking onto the cameras. "I'm not here because I'm flawless. I'm here because I know what it means to fight. To stand up when the system tells you to sit down. To keep going when the voices around you try to drown you out." She let the silence settle again, then spoke softer, but sharper. "Ask yourself who benefits from these stories. Who gains from keeping things the way they are?" The questions didn't need answers. Everyone in that room knew exactly who she meant. And outside, the city listened. For the first time, the chants outside the precinct softened. The crowd thinned. The lines between sides began to blur. People started asking the same questions Maya posed. Who really stood to lose if the system changed? But Calloway wasn't done. Behind closed doors, he pulled every string he had. He leaned on his allies, whispered in the right ears, promised favors in exchange for silence. And just when Maya thought the dust might settle, a new blow landed. A fabricated dossier leaked to a major newspaper. This one accused Maya of suppressing evidence in an old case, a case that never even existed. The details were fabricated, the signatures forged, but the damage was real. The headlines exploded. Maya Grant caught in evidence scandal. Calls for her resignation grew louder. Even some officers who'd stayed neutral now looked at her with suspicion. The weight of it all pressed down like never before. But Maya didn't bend. She gathered her team, the small circle of people who still believed in the fight. Owens, Chris, a few others who hadn't wavered. "This isn't just about me anymore," she told them. "This is about all of us, about whether we let them win. And together, they fought back. They launched their own investigation into the leaked dossier. They brought in forensic experts, tore apart every forged document, traced every digital footprint, and when they had the proof that Calloway's network had orchestrated the whole thing, they didn't hide it. Maya stood before the cameras once again, holding up the fabricated dossier. "This is what fear looks like," she told the world. "This is what the system does when it feels threatened." And slowly, the tide turned again. Officers who had once doubted her began to speak up. One by one, stories surfaced. Tales of misconduct buried, complaints ignored, cases manipulated. The walls that protected Calloway's network began to crumble. And then came the final blow. A high-ranking official, desperate to save his own skin, came forward, testified that Calloway had orchestrated the smear campaign, that he'd funded the bribes, covered up the corruption. Within weeks, Calloway was arrested. The city erupted once again, but this time, it wasn't with anger. It was with hope. The precinct felt lighter. Officers spoke freely. Again, community meetings grew larger, voices louder. People who once stood outside holding protest signs now stood inside, shaking hands, telling their stories. Maya Grant stood at the front of those meetings, listening, learning, promising transparency. "We're not here to pretend this place is perfect," she told them. "We're here to make it better." And slowly, trust began to grow. Chris Meyer, once a silent bystander, became one of the precinct's strongest voices for change. Owens, steady as ever, helped rebuild the department from the inside out. And Maya? She never forgot the fight, because she knew it wasn't over. Change doesn't happen overnight. Justice isn't a finish line. It's a journey. One step, one truth, one fight at a time. And for Maya Grant, that fight would never end. If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's that standing up for what's right isn't easy, but it's necessary. Maya Grant didn't just fight for herself, she fought for everyone who ever felt silenced, overlooked, or powerless in the face of a broken system. And the truth is, change doesn't happen overnight. It happens in small, steady steps. It happens when good people refuse to back down, even when the odds seem stacked against them. For those of us who've lived long enough to see how the world works, it's easy to feel like nothing changes. But Maya's story reminds us that courage has no expiration date. Whether you're 25 or 75, your voice matters. Your willingness to speak up, to support what's right, to challenge what's wrong, that's how we leave the world better for the next generation. So ask yourself, what would you do in the face of injustice? Would you stay silent, or would you stand up, even when it's hard? Because sometimes the greatest battles aren't won in the streets, they're won in the heart. If this message resonated with you, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who believes in justice. Together, we can keep these conversations going and maybe, just maybe, inspire the change we've all been waiting for.